The smoke stopped on a Tuesday morning. That was the first thing they noticed. A thin gray column rising from the valley at dawn, and then nothing. Gone before 8 o'clock. Gone before the temperature outside had climbed past 12 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, the men at the feed store were already talking. Nobody let a fire die on a morning like that. Not in November. Not with the kind of cold that had settled into the valley like it meant to stay. You kept the wood coming. You didn't sleep without it. You certainly didn't stop. And yet, the smoke didn't come back that afternoon, or that evening, or the following morning. One of the older men rode out to check. He expected the worst. What he found stopped him cold, not from the temperature, but from something he couldn't explain. The man inside was sitting at a rough-cut table, eating a slow breakfast. No fire burning, no embers glowing. The small iron stove in the corner had been cold for over 30 hours. And yet the air inside that strange round structure, built into the ruins of a kiln that nobody had wanted for decades, was warmer than the man's own house back in town, where he'd kept 3 fires running through the night. He asked how that was possible. The man at the table just smiled and tapped the wall beside him. Stone. Thick, ancient calcined stone. The kind that had spent years absorbing industrial heat at temperatures no fireplace could match. The kind that didn't just hold warmth, it became warmth. Nobody understood it yet. Most still didn't believe it. That old kiln had been sitting abandoned in the valley for over 30 years, a relic of a burned-out lime operation, crumbling at the top, blackened inside, considered worthless by everyone who passed it. Everyone except one man who pressed his palm flat against its wall on a cold October afternoon and felt something the others had never bothered to feel. This is the story of what he understood, and why the rest of them were wrong. If you're watching this, subscribe and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Because this kind of cold, this kind of building wisdom, it hits different depending on where you live. Long before anyone thought of sleeping inside it, the lime kiln had been the loudest thing in the valley. In its working years, local records place operations somewhere between the 1840s and early 1870s. The kiln ran almost continuously from late spring through the first hard freeze. Crews fed it raw limestone from the hillside quarry, packing the stone into the top of the cylindrical chamber and burning wood or coal at the base for days at a time. The goal was simple and brutal. Heat the limestone past 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit, drive off the carbon dioxide locked inside the rock, and collect the powdered calcium oxide, quicklime, that remained. That powder was the lifeblood of expanding frontier settlements. It made mortar, whitewash, plaster, and the early cement that held courthouses and farmsteads together across half the continent. The kiln itself was built to survive that process. Its walls had to, ranging from 24 to nearly 40 inches thick at the base. The structure was assembled from dense local limestone blocks, the same material being processed inside, laid with careful precision and packed with fired clay mortar. The interior chamber was roughly cylindrical, flaring slightly wider toward the top to allow for draft and the loading of raw stone. At the bottom, iron-grated fireboxes fed the burn. The whole thing was designed as one continuous thermal engine. Absorb heat, concentrate it, hold it, and use it to transform raw material into something more valuable. When the operation finally closed, oral accounts suggest a combination of falling lime prices and the death of the principal owner. The kiln was simply left. No demolition, no repurposing. The wooden loading scaffold rotted away within a decade. The iron grates at the base were scavenged for other uses. The top of the structure crumbled where frost worked into the mortar over many winters, leaving a jagged crown of stone open to the sky. And so it sat. For 30 years. Maybe more. The valley's residents developed a casual disregard for it that edged, over time, into something closer to superstition. Children were warned away. The interior was dark, the footing uncertain. The air smelled faintly of mineral dust, and old char farmers who worked the adjacent fields barely glanced at it. It appeared on no survey map as anything worth noting. It was simply the old kiln, a relic of an industry that had come, consumed, and departed, leaving behind a thick-walled cylinder of stone that no one knew what to do with. No one, That is, until the autumn that a quiet, deliberate man arrived in the valley with very little money, a good eye for structure, and no patience for conventional thinking. He looked at the kiln the way a stonemason looks at raw material, not for what it was, but for what it could become. What he saw in those walls, the rest of the valley would spend an entire winter learning to understand. His name, according to a handful of property records and one brief mention in a county ledger from the period, was Caleb Morrow. He had come from somewhere in the hill country to the east, the kind of man who moved when a place stopped making sense to him and kept moving until something else did. He was not wealthy. He was not trained in any formal trade. But those who encountered him in those early weeks described in oral accounts passed down through at least two local families, a man who listened more than he spoke and who had an unusual habit of touching things, walls, timber, stone, before making any judgment about them. Morrow arrived in the valley in early October, which was already late in the season to be starting anything. He had enough money to buy basic provisions and a small iron stove, but not nearly enough to purchase land or commission the construction of a proper cabin. Local timber was available, but felling, hewing, and raising a log structure alone before the first hard freeze was a race he could not win. He needed an alternative. He found on the third day. He had walked the perimeter of the old kiln twice before he touched it. Then he pressed his right palm flat against the south-facing wall, the side that caught the most afternoon sun, and held it there for a long moment. Even in October, even in the late afternoon shade, the stone held a faint residual warmth that had nothing to do with that day's sun. It was deeper than surface temperature. It was the warmth of mass. Thousands of pounds of dense limestone that had spent decades absorbing industrial heat and had never fully released it, not even after 30 years of abandonment. He spent the rest of that afternoon walking the interior of the chamber. The floor was littered with old ash, broken stone, and the decomposed remnants of the wooden loading apparatus. The top was open to the sky, but the walls rose nearly 18 feet before they began to crumble. The interior diameter at floor level was approximately 12 feet, tight but not impossible. A man could live in 12 feet of diameter if the walls around him were doing their job. Most people, looking at that ruin, saw a liability, a dangerous, filthy, structurally compromised remnant of a dead industry. Morrow saw something different. He saw a thermal shell that had already been built, not for human comfort, but for something arguably more demanding. A structure engineered by necessity to absorb, concentrate, and slowly release enormous quantities of heat. A structure whose walls were so thick, so dense, and so well cured by decades of industrial firing that they had already done something no freshly cut log wall could do. They had achieved thermal equilibrium with the deep past. He went back to town that evening, made 2 purchases, and started work the following morning. Word travels fast in a small valley, and by the end of Morrow's first week of work, most of the local residents had formed an opinion. It was not a favorable one. The general consensus, reconstructed from family oral accounts and one wry entry in a local minister's personal journal, was that the man had either lost his judgment entirely or had never possessed much of it to begin with. Building inside an old lime kiln, the idea was not just unconventional. It provoked a specific kind of discomfort in people who had spent their lives reading the land practically. The kiln was a ruin. Its top was open. Its floor was contaminated with decades of ash and quicklime residue. The structure had no windows, no proper door frame, no chinked walls, no insulation between the stone and the interior air. By every standard of frontier cabin building that the valley's residents understood, it had nothing going for it. Some objections were practical. The ash and lime dust in the floor were caustic. Oral tradition holds that at least 2 men told Morrow directly that he would ruin his lungs before spring. Others worried about structural stability, pointing to the crumbled crown of the kiln as evidence that the whole thing might come down in the right storm. One farmer reportedly offered Morrow a corner of his barn to sleep in rather than watch a man voluntarily move into what he called a stone chimney with ideas. Morrow listened politely to all of it. He did not argue. He did not explain himself in detail. He thanked the farmer for the offer and declined. What he did instead was work. Methodically, quietly, and with a precision that the skeptics would later be forced to acknowledge, even if they never fully admitted the extent of their miscalculation. He spent the first several days clearing the interior floor, removing loose stone, ash, and debris down to the hard compacted earth beneath. He mixed a simple lime and clay mortar to patch the most compromised sections of the interior wall surface, stabilizing areas where the old industrial process had fractured the stone face. He built a wooden door frame into the kiln's original loading entrance at the base, a wide, low arch that he reduced to a practical door size using a combination of fitted stone and heavy timber, packing the gaps with clay and dried moss for an initial air seal. The roof was the critical challenge, and the one that most observers assumed he would fail at. He solved it with a combination of salvaged timber poles and sod, a technique he may have encountered in earlier travels, though oral accounts are unclear on this point. The poles were laid across the interior diameter at the lowest stable point of the remaining walls, roughly 14 feet up, and packed with a double layer of cut sod and compacted clay. It was not elegant, but it was functional, and more importantly, it was continuous with the thermal logic of the walls below it, dense, slow, and reluctant to let heat escape. By the time the first hard frost arrived, Morrow had a door that closed, a roof that held, a floor of packed clay sealed with ash, and 4 walls of ancient limestone between him and the coming winter. The neighbors watched and waited. There's a tendency, when reading frontier history, to assume that more was always more. More logs, more chinking, more fires, more wool. Survival, in the popular imagination of the era, was a contest of accumulation. Whoever stockpiled the most material and generated the most heat would outlast the cold. This assumption shaped nearly every cabin built on the American frontier in the 19th century, and it shaped the firewood calculations, the construction priorities, and the sleeping arrangements of thousands of families through hundreds of brutal winters. Morrow operated from a different premise entirely, not through formal training. There is no evidence he had any, but through an intuition that the records suggest was refined by careful observation and a willingness to act against convention. His premise was this: if the shell is already doing the work, the interior system only needs to assist it. The small iron stove he had purchased in town was, by any frontier standard, undersized for the space. It had a firebox roughly 14 inches wide and 10 inches deep, adequate for a tent or a very small room, not typically considered sufficient for a 12-foot diameter stone chamber open at the top before roofing. Local accounts describe at least one man laughing openly when he saw it being carried toward the kiln. A stove that size, in a space that size, in a winter that hard, was considered somewhere between optimistic and delusional. Morrow positioned it with deliberate care. He did not center it in the room, which would have been the instinctive choice. He placed it approximately 1/3 of the way from the north wall, the coldest face of a structure, receiving the least solar exposure, and elevated it slightly on a flat stone platform roughly 6 inches high. The stovepipe exited through the sod roof via a clay-sealed collar, angled to draw without creating excessive updraft that would pull warm air out of the room faster than the stone could replenish it. The positioning was not accidental. By placing the stove off-center toward the coldest wall, Morrow ensured that the radiant heat from the firebox would strike the densest thermal mass first, the north wall, which would absorb heat more greedily than the already warmer south-facing stone. The elevated platform forced the combustion air to draw from slightly higher in the room, reducing cold floor drafting. And the deliberate undersizing of the stovepipe collar slowed the exhaust just enough to maximize heat transfer within the firebox before the gases escaped. He also made one more decision that the neighbors found baffling when they eventually heard of it. He deliberately did not fully seal the original draft openings at the kiln's base. He reduced them, packing 2 of the 3 original fireboxes with stone and clay, but left one partially open, covered with a fitted stone that could be adjusted like a damper. It looked, to outside observers, like an oversight, a gap in the construction that should have been filled. It was not an oversight. It was the most sophisticated element of the entire system. and its purpose would not become obvious until the first sustained cold snap arrived and the physics of the structure revealed themselves in a way that no amount of argument could have communicated in advance. The first fire Morrow lit inside the finished structure, packed floor, sealed walls, sod roof in place, was smaller than anyone watching would have expected. It was not a roaring frontier fire. It was not the kind of blaze a man builds when he is cold and frightened and needs immediate warmth. It was a deliberate, moderate burn. Dry hardwood, split to roughly 3-inch thickness, fed steadily over a period of approximately 5 hours at a rate that kept the stove's surface temperature between what experienced hands estimate as 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough for sustained radiant output, controlled enough to avoid overwhelming the draft and wasting combustion gases up the pipe. Morrow had figured something out in those first experimental days before the roof was complete, and the lesson had cost him one wasted burn and one cold night. Limestone of this thickness and density does not respond to intensity. It responds to duration. A roaring fire for 2 hours would superheat the air in the chamber, create a powerful updraft through the stovepipe, and send the majority of the generated heat directly out through the roof before the walls had time to absorb much of anything. The stone's thermal conductivity, its rate of accepting heat from the surrounding air and the radiant field of the stove, was slow by design. Dense limestone conducts heat at roughly 1/4 to 1/6 the rate of iron or steel. You cannot rush it. You can only feed it patiently and wait. A moderate fire for 5 to 6 hours, by contrast, would maintain a consistent radiant and convective field throughout the chamber long enough for the interior wall surface temperature to begin climbing meaningfully. Each hour of sustained burn pushed the absorbed heat slightly deeper into the 24 to 36 inches of stone. And heat stored deep in limestone does not radiate back quickly. It radiates back slowly, steadily, and for a duration that depends entirely on how deeply it was driven in. The partially open draft at the base of the kiln, that gap that had confused the neighbors, was performing a specific function during these burns. As the stove heated the air in the room, and natural convection moved that warm air upward toward the roof and stovepipe, a slight negative pressure developed near the floor. The partially open draft inlet allowed a controlled trickle of exterior cold air to enter at the very base of the stone wall, not into the living space, but through a narrow channel at floor level that ran along the interior perimeter. This cold air, drawn across the base of the massive stone walls before entering the room, pre-warmed slightly as it traveled and created a slow convective loop that encouraged the lower sections of the wall, often the coldest and most neglected in standard cabin design, to participate in the thermal exchange. It was not a perfect system. Oral accounts suggest the first 2 or 3 burns required adjustment. The draft inlet, too, opened one night, causing excessive cold infiltration. The stove feed rate too aggressive on another evening, causing a draft surge that wasted heat. But within the first week of occupancy, Morrow had calibrated the system to a reliable routine. For the 6 hours of steady moderate fire, then closure of the stove damper and the draft inlet, and then silence. The stone took over from there, and it did not give a heat back quickly. That was the secret the neighbors had never thought to consider. The question was never how fast the kiln could heat up. The question was how slowly it could cool down. The cold that arrived in the 3rd week of November was not the ordinary cold of early winter. It was the kind of cold that settles disputes. Local accounts from that period describe a sustained drop that pushed overnight temperatures to somewhere between 4 degrees Fahrenheit and 8 degrees Fahrenheit for nearly 5 consecutive days. The kind of freeze that cracked water barrels, killed livestock left in inadequately sheltered pens, and drove families in even well-constructed log cabins to burn wood at a rate they had not planned for. Families that had calculated their firewood supply with care found themselves running short by the 4th day. Men who had stacked what they thought was a full winter's worth of split hardwood were suddenly doing arithmetic they did not like. In the valley's standard log cabins of the period, single-room structures with walls averaging 6 to 8 inches of round or hewn timber, a central hearth or corner fireplace, and minimal chinking, maintaining an interior temperature above 45 degrees Fahrenheit during those nights required essentially continuous burning. A fire banked at midnight might keep the core of the room survivable until 4 or 5 in the morning. But the corners would be near freezing, the floor would be brutally cold, and any water left in a pot away from the hearth would develop a skin of ice before dawn. Oral account from several families in the valley describe exactly these conditions during that November freeze. Morrow lit his last fire of that 5-day cold snap on a Wednesday evening. He fed the small iron stove steadily for 5 hours, dry oak, split thin, a disciplined, moderate burn, and then damped it down completely just before 9 o'clock at night. He adjusted the base draft inlet to its closed position, and then he went to sleep. At 6 o'clock the following morning, when one of the neighboring farmers rode past on his way to check on a water trough that had frozen solid overnight, he noticed something that made him pull his horse to a stop. No smoke. The kiln chimney was cold and dark against the sky that had dropped to 6 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. He dismounted and knocked on the timber door. Morrow opened it after a moment. Unhurried, clear-eyed, not dressed in the heavy layers a man wears when he has spent the night fighting cold. The farmer pushed past him, half expecting to find a man who had nearly frozen and was too stubborn to admit it. The interior of the kiln was not warm in the way a roaring fire makes a room warm. That aggressive, face-flushing heat that fades the moment you step away from the source. It was warm the way a root cellar is cool, evenly, completely, from every direction at once. The air temperature inside, by the farmer's later estimation, he pressed the back of his hand against the stone wall and held it there, was somewhere above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, possibly higher. The wall itself was not hot to the touch. It was simply warmer than it had any right to be 12 hours after the last fire had been extinguished in the worst cold of the young winter. The farmer stood there for a long moment. He looked at the cold stove. He looked at the walls. He looked at Morrow, who had returned to his rough-cut table and was pouring water into a pot that had not frozen overnight. He left without saying much, but he told 3 people about it before noon, and those 3 people told others. The smoke that had stopped too early was no longer a curiosity. It was a provocation, and the valley, whether it was ready to or not, was beginning to pay attention. To understand what was happening inside those walls, it helps to think not about heat, but about memory. Every material has a capacity to store thermal energy, what engineers call specific heat, and every material has a rate at which it conducts that energy through its mass. These 2 properties together determine how a structure behaves in cold weather, and they explain, more precisely than any other factor, why the lime kiln performed the way it did. A standard frontier log wall, 6 to 8 inches of pine or fir, has relatively low thermal mass. Wood is a decent insulator, meaning it slows the movement of heat from inside to outside, but does not store much heat within its own mass. When the fire in a log cabin dies, the wood walls have absorbed very little energy to give back. The room cools relatively quickly because the walls have nothing in reserve. The heat that kept the room warm came almost entirely from the active fire, and when the fire stops, the warmth stops with it, draining through every gap in surface within a few hours. Dense limestone behaves almost oppositely. Its thermal conductivity is low enough, roughly 1.3 watts per meter Kelvin, compared to iron at nearly 80, that it moves heat slowly in either direction. But its volumetric heat capacity is substantial. A cubic foot of dense limestone can store roughly 2 to 3 times the thermal energy of the same volume of dry pine. And the lime kiln's walls were not 1 cubic foot. They were at the base between 24 and 36 inches thick. The total stone mass surrounding Morrow's 12-foot chamber has been estimated, using conservative figures for the structure's dimensions, at somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 pounds of calcined limestone. That mass, once warmed to a meaningful depth by 4 to 6 hours of sustained fire, became a thermal battery of extraordinary capacity. The key word is depth. Surface heating, running a hot fire briefly, warms only the innermost inch or 2 of stone, which then radiates back quickly and cools almost as fast as the air does. But sustained moderate heat, held over 5 or 6 hours, drives warmth progressively deeper into the wall. 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches, and beyond, storing energy in a layer of stone that the cold outside cannot reach quickly because its own conductivity is too low to pull the heat back out fast enough. The cylindrical geometry of the kiln amplified this effect in a way that a flat-walled rectangular cabin could not replicate. In a round room, every point on the wall faces every other point across the open interior space. Radiant energy, the infrared heat that a warm surface emits, travels in straight lines and strikes the opposite wall directly, warming it in turn. In a rectangular room, corners create dead zones where radiant exchange is inefficient and heat stratifies. In the kiln's cylinder, there were no corners. The radiant field was continuous, even, and self-reinforcing. Warm wall, warmed air, warmed far wall, radiated back. The entire thermal shell participated simultaneously. The result was a system that, once charged, once the stone had absorbed 5 or 6 hours of steady heat to a depth of 4 to 6 inches or more throughout the chamber, would release that energy back into the interior air at a rate slow enough to maintain livable temperatures for between 30 and 60 hours, depending on exterior conditions. Not because of any magic in the material, because of mass, geometry, and the patient, deliberate way a man had learned to feed the stone exactly what it needed, and no more. This was not primitive engineering. It was physics applied without a textbook by a man who had learned to read material the way a farmer reads soil. By the time that first winter had fully run its course, the story of the lime kiln had traveled well beyond the valley. Not loudly. There were no newspaper accounts, no formal records of Morrow's methods, no written correspondence that has survived to document the spread of the idea in precise detail. What spread instead was the kind of knowledge that moves through frontier communities the way practical wisdom always has, through observation, through imitation, and through the quietly humbling experience of watching a method work when everything you believed told you it shouldn't. Several families in the surrounding region, oral tradition holds, began paying different attention to abandoned stone structures on their land or nearby. An old spring house with thick limestone walls. A failed root cellar dug into a hillside and lined with fieldstone. A stone smokehouse that had not been used in years. Structures that had previously been considered burdens, too solid to demolish easily, too deteriorated to use in their original function, were reconsidered through a new lens. Not as ruins, but as thermal shells waiting to be inhabited. Not all of these experiments succeeded. Stone is not uniform. A structure built of porous sandstone or thin dry-laid fieldstone does not behave like a kiln wall of dense, fired limestone. Several accounts describe attempts that resulted in damp, cold, poorly ventilated spaces that confirmed the skeptics' original objections. The physics of thermal mass are real, but they are not forgiving of bad material selection or poor execution. Mass without density is not a battery, it is just weight. What the more successful adaptations shared, in every case, was a version of Morrow's core insight, that the intervention inside the shell should be minimal, that the builder's job was not to fight the structure's nature, but to understand it, to ask what the stone already wanted to do, and then arrange the interior system to let it do that work. A small, patient fire, a control draft, a sleeping space positioned against the wall, not away from it, so that the body received radiant heat from the stone directly rather than waiting for the air temperature to equalize. This approach, what a later generation of builders and historians would call adaptive reuse, though no one in that valley would have recognized the term, was not an invention. It was a recovery. Many of the techniques Morrow employed had antecedents in European vernacular building traditions, in the catch-a-loaf and stove systems of Central Europe, in the thick-walled bothies of the Scottish Highlands, in the earthen longhouses of earlier indigenous building practice across the continent. The lime kiln was a new vehicle for an old understanding, that the most durable warmth is the warmth that comes from the building itself, not from the fire inside it. Morrow had not invented anything. He had simply refused to look past the obvious the way most people had. And in doing so, he had reclaimed a heritage that the valley had been walking past for 30 years without once stopping to feel it. There is a particular kind of irony in the way modern buildings handle heat. A standard American home constructed in the past 50 years. Wood or steel stud framing, fiberglass bad insulation, half-inch drywall. Has walls that are, thermally speaking, almost nothing. The insulation slows heat loss, which is valuable. But the total thermal mass of those walls is negligible. A modern 2,000 square foot home might contain, in its entire wall assembly, less than a few hundred pounds of material with any meaningful heat storage capacity. The rest is air, paper, and polymer. To compensate for this absence of mass, modern homes run their heating systems continuously or near continuously throughout cold weather. The furnace cycles on and off, maintaining air temperature within a narrow band, because the moment the heat source stops, the air temperature begins to fall. There is nothing in the walls to slow the decline. The house does not remember warmth. It only knows the warmth it is currently being given. The average American household spends roughly 40 to 45% of its total energy budget on space heating. In colder climates, that figure rises higher. And a substantial portion of that expenditure is not warming the occupants. It is compensating for the thermal amnesia of the building envelope itself. Caleb Morrow's lime kiln consumed, by a conservative reconstruction of his described burn routine, 4 to 6 hours of moderate hardwood combustion every 1 to 2 days during sustained cold, perhaps 1/5 to 1/4 the firewood that a comparable sized log cabin of the period would have required for continuous overnight heating. His building did not need to be told to stay warm every few hours. Once charged, it held. The stone remembered. The contrast is not simply historical. It is architectural, and it points to a category of error that modern construction culture has largely institutionalized. The belief that energy input can substitute indefinitely for material intelligence. That you can build thin and compensate with power. That the building envelope is a passive container, but the mechanical system is the active agent of comfort. The lime kiln inverted this logic entirely. The building was the active agent. The fire was merely the means of charging it. And once charged, the building needed no further instruction. This is not an argument against insulation, or against modern construction codes, or against the very real advances in air tightness and vapor control that have made contemporary buildings far more efficient than their 19th century predecessors in important respects. It is rather a recognition that a certain kind of thermal intelligence, the intelligence embedded in mass, geometry, and material density, was understood intuitively by builders who had no textbooks and no engineering degrees, and has been largely abandoned by a construction industry that replaced it with mechanical systems that work until they don't. When the power goes out in a modern house during a winter storm, the temperature inside begins to fall within hours. When Caleb Morrow's fire went out on a November night, his walls held the warmth until morning, and often well into the following day. The stone did not need electricity. It did not need a thermostat. It did not need a utility company. It needed only to be understood. And one quiet, deliberate man, in a valley where everyone else had already walked past the answer, had taken the time to stop, press his palm flat against the wall, and listen. Some things, it turns out, the old structures already knew. We simply forgot to ask them. This content is educational and historical in nature. It does not substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.